first homework assignment that you had, it did ask you to come in on this application that you're creating, and it said add C# code to make the application work. And it says create a click event for the confirm button of the quotation page. It should redirect you to the confirmation page, which will display the quotation that's being confirmed by getting the data from session state. What they're saying is you want to be able to take information and copy it from page to page. And one of the ways that you can do that is via session state. All right. So that's what Chapter 8 is about. We had a little prelude to it before, but Chapter 8 itself is on session state. Yes. No, session, HTTP is stateless. So by default, as you're sending HTTP requests out to a server and you're getting it back, the server really has no way of knowing, unless you let it know, that they're coming from the same source. As far as it's concerned, if you send out a request and then you send out another request 30 seconds later, as far as the server is concerned, it's just two different requests from two different sources. But if for example, if you're working on an e-commerce site, you'll have to constantly be passing information back and forth. So you'll need to use session state to be able to do that. And if you don't use session state, you use cookies. The main difference between using session state and using cookies is session state stuff is typically written to the server, cookie stuff is typically written to the client. It works the same way. Usually session state, it depends, but at least at times session state may have a longer lifetime, or it may expire as soon as the session ends. It's up to you by setting the parameters for it. Cookies can expire as soon as the session ends, or they can remain forever. The example that they show at the end of this chapter, it's one of those things where they have you going back to this Halloween page, they have you log in. All right, and once you've logged in once, the next time you log in again, they have somebody named Mary something or other log in, and then when she comes back to log in again, it says, "Hello, Mary." All right, that kind of an idea. So that's a lot of times that's with cookies. Or if you go out to a site and they ask you some preferences that you have, maybe font color, font size, font whatever, they can save those as cookies and check to see if those exist, and the next time you come out to that site, then they can go in and set all that stuff up for you ahead of time. All right. And again, kind of like what John asked before, but this stuff basically applies in one way or another, maybe not done exactly syntactically the same way, but view state's view state. All right. And when you start working with sessions and you start working with cookies, it pretty much is the same amongst any kind of server language. All right. So what they're saying here is view state is the one you get automatically. You get this hidden input field that's called _ view state. We looked at this again a little bit earlier in an earlier chapter, but it's going to look, whoops, it's going to look, they don't show an example of it, but it'll say view state equals, and it'll be 30 or 40 characters long. All right, and it's got a lot of information that basically the server has stuffed into there for you, and it puts it into something that literally, usually .NET refers to it as a grid bag. All right, and it's a holder, and it's got all this information in there, and you may look at it that might not make any sense, but it makes sense, all right, to the actual program itself. It's not something you should monkey with. If you don't want it, you can disable it. When you disable view state, you can turn view state off for an entire site. So if you had a site that had a lot of very complex material or very private confidential material, you might turn view state off for the whole site, because remember, since it's a hidden field, if somebody does a right mouse click and chooses view page source, they can see it. All right. So you can disable it on a page basis, you can disable it on a control basis, you can disable it on a site basis. All right, and they talk about that here. We're not going to be jacking with it very much to beginning period. All right. You can also use it to store your own data if you want to, and they show you this on 266 and 267. So let's look at it here on 267. All right. So they're saying these two things do the exact same thing. You can either say viewstate.add, all right, tell it the name that you want to add and the value that that name has. So again, it's a key value pair. Or you can say view state and put it in brackets like this. Again, you can do a lot of stuff like this also in PHP or in JavaScript. So when you're doing it, you've got multiple ways of doing it. All right? And is this a big thing? Is one of these ways better than the other? It looks to me, looking at it real close, like it's almost the same amount of characters that you type. So it's a matter of personal preference. All right? The key thing to realize is when you look at this, the view state stuff can appear on the left-hand side of an equal sign if you're assigning something to it, or on the right-hand side of an equal sign when you're taking what's in there and assigning that to a variable. Notice here we want to take what's in view state and we want to assign it to a date-time variable, but we have to cast it because you have no guarantee if it's in view state, it's in a format that the server can understand, but that you may or may not be able to understand. So that's why they're doing the casting right there. If you want to remove it from viewState.remove. So here's the major things that you would work with. Add, clear, and remove. All right, and again, you're using key value pairs. Very similar to what we looked at with associative arrays, both in JavaScript and in PHP. All right, now here's your favorite. So session state. All right. As it says, ASP.NET uses session state to track the state of each user in an application. Not only that, you've got your choice over how you do session state and how you want to do it. It can be done in a multiple number of ways. What you're going to see when we look at the code, it's not going to look that different from view state. But where you had view state before, you'll replace it with the word session. All right? So, as it says right here, ASP.NET creates a session state object that contains the unique session ID for each user's session. All right, and John, since he's gone through Doug's program, he knows much more about this than I do. But a popular thing for people who try to do bad things on the web is they try to do what's called session hijacking. And what happens with session hijacking is somebody is able to get a hold of your session ID. If they can get a hold of your session ID, for all intents and purposes, they are now you. So how do you get around that? Well, there's two ways mainly. One way, I guess three. One is you do nothing and hope it doesn't happen, which isn't the best way. The second way is a lot of times what happens is once you get into like, for example, once you get to a checkout page or some page when you're going to start to give information that's really critical, what you do is you regenerate the session ID so you get a new one. All right? And so what that means is if somebody gets the old one, they can only go so far. Or and typically if you regenerate, the old one goes away. So even if they do hijack it, they're hijacking the old one. And sometimes, if it's, again, really that sensitive, you may regenerate the session ID several times during the session just to try to keep it harder and harder for people to get into your stuff. All right, so that's one way. All right, the other way is you can make sure that as soon as the session ends, you destroy the session ID. By default, I believe with most programming languages, and I think ASP.NET is the same, most of the time the session ID automatically expires 20 minutes after you log out. All right. Now, that doesn't mean everything does, and it doesn't mean that everything is going to be thrown in there because sometimes sessions and cookies work together. So sometimes if you throw something into a cart and you haven't bought it yet, but you keep it there and you leave, that stuff may stay in a session variable, but it also may very well be put into a cookie. So the next time you come back to that same site and you go back to that same cart, that information is there. It's really dangerous to do that and leave it in there as a session because what if I don't come back for a day, a month, a year, or whatever? All right, so probably you'll do that with a cookie. So it says all three of the examples that are shown on the next page here, so on 269, they all assume that session state is being accessed from the code behind file on the web page. All right, so what does that mean? That means that you're using code to do this. This isn't the kind of thing you want to do on the .aspx page. You want to do this on the .aspx.cs page. You want to do this using C# code. So what does this mean? This means that you want to take a variable that's called email and you want to copy it to your session, the equivalent of your session array, and call it email. So now that variable will be available across pages. All right? And again, as you see, the session stuff can appear either on the left-hand side or on the right-hand side. So here we're copying it. Here we're taking it and we're converting it to a string and we're putting it into a string variable. All right? Why would we do this? Well, remember, in the example that they show right here, it could be that we're copying stuff back and forth between what's in a text field on a page, and we want to throw it into session state so we can go onto another page and put it into another text field on that page. That's how you typically use this stuff. Again, is if you want to take information and copy it back and forth between pages. When you're done, you remove it. All right, and notice this. A statement that retrieves a session state item from a non-page class. Well, what does that mean? That means that, again, this isn't associated with a class anyplace. So, sometimes in order to get the information you want, you've got to dig a little deeper. All right? And if you remember, one of the things that we talked about is that one of the differences between doing a post and a get is when you do a get, that information is up in the query string. If you do a post, it's in the HTTP header. Remember that? That's going into the HTTP header, basically. All right. So, when to save and when to retrieve these. On page 270, as it says, most developers use session state in a consistent way. Let's put that into context. If there's 3 ways of doing the same thing, most developers pick out a way they're comfortable with and use that way all the time. Why? Because it just makes sense to do that. All right? And so they say first you retrieve the data from the session state and store it in a variable. All right? Then, as it says, you use these variables when you need to with events. Copying stuff back and forth or whatever. So the idea is what you'll typically want to use this for is I want to grab something and copy it, for example, from a database onto a page. After it's on the page, I want the ability on that page to remove or to change it, all right, to modify it. But when I get done, then I might want to send it to another page, and then when I'm done with stuff on that page, I might want to take all that information, both new stuff I added and updated information, and copy it back again to the server. And that's why you use this. And that's really what the author is saying right here. So the author says the first 2 examples are taken from chapter 4. So it's stuff we have been doing already, in other words. And that's right. These 2 examples that are right here. All right? So as it says, the first example uses the getCart method to get a cart list or a cart item list object from session state and store it in a variable named cart. All right? So this is going over the stuff we have in a session and it's copying it over. That's a class variable right there that we're copying it into. So what does that have in it? Anything the cart has in it. Any of the items that we put into the cart, maybe their product number, maybe their price, the number we ordered, etc., all that stuff. All right. And here we want to update. All right. So if we click the remove button, we're going back then into session state. So we have to check the cart to see, are there any items in there? Did we check an item that we wanted to remove? All right. Or if we removed everything, is there anything in there to remove? So again, if you do that, you'll remove it. So we're going to the cart variable, all right, and then we're going to end up writing it back. Right. A pre-render event handler that updates a value in a cart object. This isn't a great example, but when you look at this, what this could be, this is a cart count, so this is how many items you have in there, all right? But, you've all seen this, right, where you go out to a site and you've got a hit counter. That's something you could use with this too. That would literally be the kind of thing that you want to keep up and active 100% of the time. All right, but it wouldn't be a cookie because that wouldn't make any sense. But if you were tracking how many times the site was hit, you wouldn't have that individual. That would be on a basis where everybody could use it, see it, update it, etc. And if somebody gets a hold of your hit counter and they first of all, they never should be able to, but if they do and they change it, what's the worst thing they can do? They could make it real huge, or they could make it negative, or do whatever. You just have to monitor it, at least infrequently, and so if that happens, you'd manually change it. That's all. So the different options you have, as it says, for storing session data and for tracking session IDs. All right. Notice what they mention here. It says, by default, ASP.NET stores session state data in server memory, and it tracks user sessions using cookies. The default is what you see up here. It says the default is in process mode, the first one that you see up there on the chart. With this mode, session state is stored in memory within the same process in which the application runs. And you might say, well, who cares? The reason that that's kind of a big deal is if it's in the same process, all right, it's able to be processed faster because the stuff is closer to each other in memory. All right, that's typically only good if it's a single server that you're using. I mean, if it's Amazon, you're not doing this. You've got stuff pinging back and forth between servers all over the place. All right. So it says if you're going to be working at a big site, if you have so many users that one server can't handle it, you'll probably end up using state server mode or the SQL server mode. All right. So with state server mode, as it says right there, it stores it in memory under a state service. So you've got a server farm. So it knows where to go to get the information. So your database information might be on one server or even broken up over multiple servers. All right. And as it says, with an SQL server, it's used for applications that require more than one IIS server. All right. If none of those work, you can create your own with a custom server. So again, I mean, I wouldn't know how to do this, but this would be something that if you were going to do this, this would take a heck of a lot of work when you think about it. So again, with the options that they mentioned there in the middle of the page, 2 options for tracking session IDs. Again, the one is cookie-based. That's dangerous. If somebody is able to, that sounds funny, I know, but if somebody's able to steal your cookies, they can become you. All right? And there's other things that you can do that people don't even realize. Because most of the time when people have cookies and stuff, they don't even know they're there. You know, I told my kids, they were like, Dad, this computer's running really slow. And I said, well, you know, have you cleaned out cache? Have you deleted old cookies? And they're like, cookies? You know, and I showed them, and then they started doing it. But most people don't even know that it exists. All right? And they don't see the need to do that. But again, the problem with doing that is when something is in a cookie, it's just text data, but that's also a bad thing. Because depending on what's being stored in there, there should never be sensitive information. But somebody could find out information about you by getting into your cookies. But if you use cookieless, as it says, then it's encoded as part of the URL. Well, if you're going to do that, if you are going to do that and have it in as part of the URL, so it's part of the query string, then you want to encode it before you put it in there. So you want to put some kind of an encoding mechanism so if somebody's able to steal it, what they're going to see is some big ugly type of thing. All right? They're going to have to figure out the decoding mechanism in order to be able to do that. All right. Also, there's stuff that's involved here in your web.config file. Some of this stuff we've looked at already. The mode is one of those modes that we just talked about, or no mode whatsoever. Are you using cookieless or cookie-based? All right. This is what I mentioned before, that timeout. All right. As it says, 20 minutes is the default that a session should be maintained without any user activity. So if you either stop the session or you're just not using it for a while, it'll time out. And that's done for your safety. All right. The state connection string, as it says, the server name or IP address and port number. And, you know, again, I may have told this to you already. Some of this stuff, some of this can be grabbed, like things like IP addresses, etc. A certain amount can be grabbed with things like Google Analytics. And marketing people, marketing companies, they want that information from you. They want to be able to track you as much as possible. I mean, if marketing companies had their way, they'd be Big Brother. Why? Because then they know who to target different types of emails for. If they know that I went out and bought myself a $2,000 treadmill, all right, they know probably, first of all, okay, I must have some money. And second of all, if I'm willing to pay $2,000 for a treadmill, I might be willing to pay a few $100s for some accessories or something that goes with it. On the other hand, if they're able to track it and they know that I went to Walmart and I got a treadmill for $189, I'm going to be on their lower end type of thing. And there's a whole big market out there. And again, I've said this kind of thing to you before. People don't realize when they sign up for something and they click that checkbox that says, you agree to our terms and conditions, Usually what's buried in there is that they can grab any information about you that they want and use it any way they want to use it. Now, not every company does that. In fact, many companies go out of their way and they tell you, we don't use any of your information without your permission. But a lot more companies don't tell you that. And they sell. There are firms that buy that information about you. All right, the SQL connection string we already talked about. Allows custom SQL database, as it says. You can specify the name of the database used to store state information. So this is the way the stuff is going to be put in. All right. Now, that wasn't a lot. All right, maybe that didn't answer any of the questions that anybody had. So I'd say go back to chapter 4 and between that and here, just look at the examples and just try some stuff. What's the worst thing that's going to happen? It's not going to work. All right, everybody knows what caching is. Cache is a certain part of memory. All right, and for instance, what CNN will do, for example, is if I go out to CNN.com and I'm looking at their site, and let's say that I get out and then I bring it back up again, within a matter of minutes. If it hasn't changed, I might have a cached version that's already in memory, and it'll bring that up. All right, the positive, or the advantage, I should say, of caching is the fact that it'll be faster. It's already in memory. The disadvantage is you have to watch your cache time. All right, how fast before you let cache time out where you have to go and make a call back to a server. All right, so you're able to minimize the amount of work that you're doing for a server, using round trips to the server by using cache, and that's what they mentioned on 274. They say it's typically used to store application-specific data that changes infrequently. So you're not going to be using cache for like an e-commerce store, not if you're constantly adding and removing stuff. All right. Items that are stored in application state stay in memory until they're specifically moved or until the application ends. And they go through all this stuff. Again, I don't want to read to you. Application concepts, cache concepts, and application state concepts. All right. Again, more transient types of stuff in here, more static types of stuff up here. All right. You just keep that in mind. Hopefully you'll be all right then. When you work with application state and with cache data as shown here on page 277, again, you'll notice, just like we looked at before, there's a lot of work that's done basically with key value types of pairs. All right. Now, this can get a little bit more tricky. All right. We mentioned this before, but I want you to see that line right here that's in your book on 277. I don't think you have to do anything like that this semester. But what this is saying right here, this is using the equivalent of what we talked about in Java string of an array list. This is saying I'm going to use a list of strings. All right. Why? Because a lot of the stuff that you work with application state and cache, you use an array list type of syntax to work with. All right. And again, you say, well, this is the first I've seen it. Yeah, but I don't use this stuff very often, and I'm not going to lie to you. If I was a full-time ASP.NET programmer, yeah, I'd know a lot more about this than I do. All right. So as far as working with application events, here on page 279, notice they mention here, these are the 4 common events. The application starts and ends, the session starts and ends. So you can associate code with any of those. All right. Notice none of them return anything. So for instance, when the application starts, they've got some kind of a hit counter that they're setting up in here. When it ends, you're updating the hit counter. All right. And notice for the session, you're locking things out. All right. And then you'll be unlocking them probably when you're done. So what do you do in there? Well, that's what's explained up on the top. Notice again, application start, raised when the first page of the application is requested by a user. Often used to initialize the value of those application state items. End, raised when the application is about to terminate. Used to write things out typically to a database. You want the latest and greatest changes. So you wait until typically application end to write them back. Session start when the user session begins. As it says, it initializes session state items. Session ends, again, when the session's about to terminate. To free resources, close databases, close file connections, or whatever it is you might or need to do. All right? Kind of like a finally in Java when you're doing try-catch. All right, next they give you a couple pages here. I guess about 6 pages here on cookies. A cookie will look like like this, but this is the name of the cookie. Remember a couple things about cookies. By default, most browsers will only let you write about 20 cookies out at a time, and once you have more than that, all right, they'll start removing the oldest ones. All right, cookies typically can only be about 4K in length, so they're not that big, and cookies only contain text. If you would ever find, this is just something, and you should never, ever, ever find a site that is using cookies and is putting personal information in cookies, ever. And if they are, it should be encoded first or encrypted. But if you go out to a cookie and you open it up and you see like your passwords and stuff in there, I'd never use that site again. That's just me speaking. I wouldn't. You say, well, what if it's Blackhawk? Well, then you're kind of hosed. But I'd at least let somebody know that that's the case. So here's some examples of cookies. Again, that's a big one. That's the session ID. All right. Other things, user IDs, etc. And we've talked about some of this stuff before. All right. And with other stuff. So for instance, here, when you set this up, this is typically known as an expiry date for a cookie. And if you want a cookie to be automatically removed, we talked about this already in PHP, but we're talking about it again. If you set the cookie to a date in the past, or even an hour past the current time, that cookie will automatically expire then. But you literally, it would be possible for you to go in right now and set up a cookie like this and give it an expiry date, if you wanted to do so, of 9/18/3014. The system doesn't check anything. It just says, is it a date in the future? All right? And, not to be a jerk, but we're going to be dust by then anyway in 1,000 years, right? But technically, that would be set, and that would be the expiry date for it. All right? You have to give cookies a name, and you have to give them a value, but those are the only 2 things that you have to put in. If you put secure in there, what you're saying is, I want that to only go over an HTTPS, a secure socket layer connection. Transport layer connection or layer socket connection, whatever it's called now. All right. So notice there they've done it. They changed the expires date and they did an add years. One thing about cookies, when they're about to expire, it's not like you get a warning. Hey, your cookies are about to expire. Do you want to extend them or whatever? That's when it expires. You could still go in there programmatically to a user and check for stuff like that if you wanted to. And think about it. If I had an e-commerce site, I might write some code that if somebody has had something in their cart for a while and they haven't done anything with it to remind them, oh, believe me, Amazon does that with me all the time. I throw stuff in my cart all the time and then don't buy it. And usually within a week, they'll give me a message, Jeff, we noticed that you've had this inactivity on your cart. You still have this in there. And just so you know, people who bought this often also buy this. That's great marketing when you think about it. That's what they're doing. So again, a cookie is a name value pair, and unlike the session ID and the session stuff that's stored on the server, it's stored on the browser. As far as working with cookies, you'll notice when you see here, no real set cookie and get cookie. All right, you create the cookie like this, and you get the values of the cookie by coming in here and asking for it, all right? Request.cookies and then the stuff that's in here. What you're going to see when we talk about this and I mentioned this, but just in passing in PHP. In PHP where you've got your $_ post and you've got your $_ get, you also have a $_ cookies. All right, that's how it's used in there. So they all work the same way, all right, but some have add cookie, etc., some don't. What they're doing is essentially the same. But that's one of the things that differentiates the package, is the way that they syntactically go about doing it. And actually, logically, there could be some differences. They should be minimal. All right. All right. As far as enabling and disabling cookies, we've talked about this before. That you have to go out and do it on the browser. Notice if you set your security level up as high as possible, as it says, it blocks all cookies. That's a lie, because even when it blocks all cookies, there will still be some cookies written, such as a cookie that if you're using session IDs through cookies, that'll still be written. I don't care what anybody tells you. All right, it will be. Most people have theirs set in the middle. All right, if you set it at the bottom, then you're saying, I don't care. Maybe I need friends. I don't know, that kind of an idea. All right. But if you want to turn them off or turn them on, enable or disable, there's the way that you do it in the 3 major browsers. Okay. And again, and I probably haven't done it here for a while, but when I go into here, so right now as an example, all right, so right now I'm in Firefox. And if I go and click over here and click my open menu and I go down to history, all right, and it'll say clear recent history. So what do I want to clear? Notice what it gives me by default. All right. And if I say I want it to clear everything, I can just do it for the last hour, last 2 hours, last 4 hours, just today, or everything, and I'm going to clear it. All right. How long will that take? Typically just a matter of seconds, maybe a minute. And again, this is me because I'm that way. But to me, IE always seems to take the longest. Maybe for some reason they have the most cookies. Maybe it has the worst algorithm. I don't know. But now when I go back in there and I start going back to something that I've already been using, so if I go to Blackhawk, all right, you may or may not have noticed that, but before it had a whole listing of things under Blackhawk. Now it's just the one that I currently have open. All right, that's all let's remember. You should always be doing that. You should be clearing your cookies out. Even on these machines, you should be doing that on a regular basis. Because what happens is all that stuff gets put in a temporary directory, and even if it's just junk that you don't need, it's still taking up room. All right, that doesn't need to be taken up. It's a right thing to do, and you definitely should be doing it on your own machines. All right, URL encoding is next. Just a couple more pages, and then we're done with the chapter. About 6 more pages. So URL encoding, as it says, it provides another way to maintain state. The information is stored in a query string that's at the end of the URL. But again, remember, with typical URL encoding, you get this. So what does that say? This is the query string, everything after the question mark. This says the category is FX and the product is FOG01. So if you're going to be sending stuff like that, that would be stuff that would be equated probably with a GET, and it would be stuff that would be equated with stuff that is not. All right, if you're going to send things in clear text, which is what this is, it would be nothing that's sensitive. There are ways that you can go in here if you're going to send things in the URL that you can still do some encoding with it. Not only that, you know what else? Has everybody heard the term pretty printing and pretty URLs? The idea is, if you look up on the screen here, that I don't want the user to even see this kind of stuff. All right, what I might want them to say is just product.asp/fog01, so they know where they are. All right, that would be kind of creating a pretty URL. There are tools out there that do that for you. All right, an application that uses cookies, application state, and caching. Again, what that is right here, if you look, is they tell you to select the product, and they're assuming that you've already come out over here and you've already logged in. So there's your first checkout page. You log in with just your first name and your last name. You click continue, and then lo and behold, that when you go to an order page that uses that stuff, we run the checkout, but when you go back to order, welcome back, Mary. All right, and all it's doing is grabbing that information that you put in there, and I think it's saving it in the cookie. All right, not any big type of thing in there. The code to do that is shown in the book on 291, which is the end of the chapter here. And what I like is what the author always does here is he takes and right up above that puts in a comment and grays it out so you can see it. So get first name from cookie and set the welcome message if one exists. All right, so if it's not null, welcome back followed by that value. Get last update from cache, then display it, or set last update to cache, now plus 10. Well, again, the idea is, notice that with the cache update time, that's really an important type of thing that I probably skipped over. Because depending on what you're using, the browser or whatever, the package, if you're using ASP.NET, for cache state, sometimes if you've got a very critical site, something that's going to be updated often, you literally might not even want to allow caching. Or you might want to set caching that, if you've got it set so it's going to recache every 1 minute, you might as well not even be caching. All right, so it just depends on what it is. Remember again, the caching is used for non-critical, I should say that. It's used for static type of data that's not going to change off. All right, so we finished this chapter, and what we'll do then next week between Tuesday and Thursday is we'll go over chapter 9, which are master pages, and then we'll go over chapter 10, which is on themes, and we'll go over chapter 11, which is on navigation and routing. What you're going to find in those 3 chapters is I'm going to go back a lot more to the code, all right, that's in your book. And we're going to look at code to see what happens when you start playing with themes and the like. All right, so that's it.